and it took an incredibly long time for such a short book. So it took 8 years, about 1 year per chapter. And I think the best analogy for the book is the very sexy analogy of duplicate bridge. So how many of you play bridge? Okay, that's a very low penetration of bridge players. Okay, so the way duplicate bridge works, duplicate bridge is an advanced form of bridge in which a group of teams of 2 show up in a room. They're divided into tables of 4, each of which is then dealt the exact same cards in the exact same sequence. So minimizing the role of luck. At the end of the evening, the team with the most points wins, right? So it's designed to be a pretty pure test of skill. And I would argue over long periods of time, the average tenure for the 8 CEOs in the book was over 20 years, over long periods of time within an industry, everybody is dealt effectively the same hand. So if one company massively outperforms the peer group, that's worthy of study. So the 8 CEOs and the 8 companies, they all had to fit that pattern, and they had to meet 2 tests. The first of those is they had to have better returns relative to the S&P 500 than Jack Welch had during his 20-year tenure at GE. So the first test is an absolute return test, right? So this is the S&P 500. Please notice the x-axis, that's 25 years. That's returns to the S&P 500 over 25 years. Jack Welch, in his 20-year tenure at GE, had excellent returns. He outperformed the S&P 500 by 3.3 times, so exceptional compounded returns. And the CEOs had to have better performance relative to the S&P than Jack Welch had, absolute return threshold. Then, to the duplicate bridge analogy, they then needed to massively outperform their peer group, right? So there's the peer group's returns. And those are the outsider group returns, okay? So they outperformed the S&P 500 by 20-fold on average, and their peer group by 7-fold. All of which begs the question, so how is that outperformance possible? And by definition, they needed to be doing things differently than the peers. They needed to be making different decisions, taking different actions. But it turned out that the specific things they were doing were remarkably similar across the 8. And the primary area of overlap was in capital allocation. Okay, and I think the best way to think about capital allocation is that to be a successful long-term CEO, you need to do 2 things well. You need to optimize the profits of the business that you're running, but you also then need to invest or deploy or allocate those profits. And over long periods of time, that second activity is equally important. It has a significant impact on per-share outcomes. So if you took 2 companies with identical operating results, the same level of revenue and the same level of free cash flow, and over 20 years you played that forward, and the companies pursued 2 different approaches to capital allocation, you'd get 2 very different per-share outcomes for owners. And the framework there, which we'll go into more detail, is in a company, as the CEO, there are really only 3 ways that you can source capital to invest. You can tap your free cash flow, you can raise equity, you can issue debt. That's it. And there are really only 5 things you can do with it. You can invest in your existing operations, you can buy another company, you can pay a dividend, you can repurchase your shares, and you can pay down debt. Again, that's it. If you look at the left-hand side here of the x-axis, over short periods of time, differences in capital allocation don't necessarily matter, but over long periods of time, they have an enormous impact on outcomes. So we're going to dive in detail into that framework, but beforehand, I want to share the other set of findings from the book. I want to talk a little bit about the personal characteristics of the 8. So they came from a wide variety of backgrounds. One was a former astronaut, one a widow who'd been out of the workforce for almost 40 years. One inherited the family business. 2 of them were high-level mathematicians. But they shared a common set of interesting set of personal characteristics. All of them were first-time CEOs. Maybe the most surprising finding in the book. Half of them under 40 when they got the job. Only 2 had MBAs, but 4 had engineering degrees. So if you're going to reach for adjectives to describe them, you would not use sort of the traditional CEO adjectives of strategic or visionary or charismatic. Instead, you'd use words like pragmatic, one of your P's, flexible, independent, cool, analytical, humble, frugal, words like that. And I'm just going to quickly tell a couple of stories that highlight a few of those characteristics, and then we'll dive into the capital allocation framework. One of the CEOs was a guy named Tom Murphy, who ran a company called Capital Cities, which was a TV and radio station operator in the 70s and 80s. And when he was first hired by the owner at Capital Cities, they owned one television station in Albany, New York, and it was located in a dilapidated former convent. And so the owner said to Tom, I'm going to send you out to Albany to run this TV station. I'm going to leave you alone. I just asked two things. One, I want you to find a way to make it profitable. And the second thing is you've got to paint that building. It's an embarrassment. No advertisers are going to give us any business without it. So Tom goes out to Albany, and he paints the two sides facing the road, right? So in doing that, he sets this tone, this sort of cultural story around frugality that gets told to every general manager from that point forward who ever runs a business for Capital Cities. Another story, one of the other CEOs is a guy named Bill Stewart, who ran Ralston Purina. And he was bidding in the RGR Nabisco buyout, which was the largest buyout ever at that time, a sort of iconic late 80s transaction. And a guy that I know was working at Goldman Sachs, and his job was to run the data room. So all the buyers would come through the data room. They'd look at these, this is old-fashioned 1980s data room, stacks of paper everywhere, all of the operating information on every plant they owned and all the contracts with suppliers. And so this guy, who was a junior guy at Goldman Sachs, he'd just clock in the different companies that came in to look at buying these assets, and they'd bring teams of accountants and lawyers and financial analysts, and they'd go through all the material. So he's ticking through the list, and he sees the next company to come in is Ralston Purina. And he opens the door, and it's a single middle-aged guy with a legal pad. And it's Bill Stewart, the CEO. And Bill Stewart sits down, asks an hour worth of questions, takes notes, leaves, and submits his bid the next morning. No detailed consultants, investment bankers, or other involvement. So independence. I grew up in Boston, and I used to go to movies at a movie theater in a suburb of Boston. I saw sort of Jaws there and Star Wars and all the 70s and 80s things. And as you left the back of that movie theater, there was a small office off to the left-hand side. It was a general cinema movie theater. And I just assumed my whole life that that was the office of the movie theater manager. But it turned out that up the stairwell behind that door was the office of General Cinema Corporation, which was one of the largest chains of movie theaters in the country, the majority owner of the Neiman Marcus retail chain, and the largest Pepsi bottler in the country. So again, sort of humility. Okay, this is the framework I described earlier. So sources and uses, these are the ways that capital can come into a business and the ways it can be deployed. And let's just quickly tick through them. So on the sources side, there's sort of a natural hierarchy there. Obviously, tapping free cash flow, that's the least expensive, non-controversial way to tap capital. All of the outsider CEOs were intensely focused on optimizing free cash flow, which meant not just worrying about their margins, their sort of operating income, but as Michael said, really being thoughtful about how to surgically optimize net working capital and CapEx, and also taxes. This group was very focused on taxes, which obviously have a significant effect on long-term compounding. So if you have capital projects or growth that can't be funded internally, you need to look at other sources. And sort of the next down in the waterfall is debt. All of the outsider CEOs were consistent users of debt. Their methodology there is that they tended to spend time thinking about the ideal band of leverage for their companies, including the leverage they could run at during cyclical downturns. And they were very disciplined in maintaining leverage within that band, typically sort of 2 to 4 times EBITDA. That's a long way from the 6 times EBITDA Dave talked about yesterday. But they were all consistent users of debt over time. As a group, they tended to They were very cautious about equity issuances. They were hawks around dilution. And they did, however, occasionally, when their stock was priced at high levels, they were comfortable issuing it to do large deals. The best example of that is Warren Buffett, who used his stock when it was priced at the all-time peak price to book value in 1998 to buy a company called Gen Re, a large reinsurance company, the largest acquisition actually in the history of Berkshire. But generally, they were very cautious around equity issuances. Shifting to uses, sort of the core default capital allocation alternative is investing in organic growth. That's the highest probability way to add value per share, for sure. I'm guessing for most of you, that's the core and primary capital allocation alternative. And as long as the math makes sense to do that, as long as the customer acquisition cost to lifetime value math is compelling, you want to do as much of that as you can. If you have excess cash following your organic growth needs, you can sort of look to the remaining alternatives. Dividends. So the Outsiders Group was generally very cautious around dividends. And the primary reason for that is they were all C Corps. And as you guys all know, dividends are extremely inefficient in C Corps. They're taxed twice. So they were very cautious about dividends. They generally paid low dividends. In the case of Henry Singleton at Teledyne and at Warren Buffett, they paid no dividends over the course of their tenures. They tended to retain that capital for other purposes. Share repurchases, they were all pretty active repurchasers of their shares. The dynamic as a public company CEO is every morning you get up and you can repurchase your shares. You can see the value of the company in the market. No one is in a better position than you to calculate the projections for the business going forward and to calculate returns. And every now and then when you do that, the public market will be misappraising the value of your company and you have an opportunity to retire shares at attractive returns. But the other dynamic about that that's useful is that it gives you a benchmark to compare other capital allocation alternatives against. And this group was active in repurchasing shares. All of them repurchased at least 30% of their shares over time. These CEOs, they ran those companies within bands, the debt within bands, and so they would allocate capital to pay off debt, but not very excitedly. They would do that sort of just to stay disciplined, but that was sort of a default alternative for them, and returns associated with debt reduction are very low. They basically equal the interest rate. But I want to talk for a minute about acquisitions. So this group created enormous value through acquisitions. And as all of you have probably read, 2/3 to 3/4 of acquisitions in American business actually destroy value. So I want to try to distill some of the lessons from this group. Number one is that their pattern for acquisition was that they did them very occasionally. Very occasional large acquisitions. They were comfortable waiting long periods of time between acquisitions, waiting for things that were compelling. Dick Smith, the CEO at General Cinema, made 3 acquisitions in 20 years, but they created enormous value for his shareholders. They tended to source transactions outside of auctions. This was true when Tom Murphy bought ABC. He went and visited the head of ABC, who'd known for many years, Leonard Goldenson. It was true when Bill Sturritz at Ralston Purina bought Continental Baking, the maker of Hostess and Twinkies. And he wrote a direct letter to the parent company at ITT, sourced it directly through that. And it was true also when Dick Smith bought the largest Pepsi bottler. It had been a supplier to him. So they sourced things directly. They avoided auctions. They had a clear path to value creation. So they had a clear game plan for how they were going to add value after acquisition. This typically involved high probability cost savings. In the case of Capital Cities, when they bought ABC, they were able to improve the operating margins of those TV stations, the ABC TV stations, by 1,000 basis points in 24 months while improving ratings. In the case of TCI, which was run by a guy named John Malone, he had sort of contractual pricing discounts. He could buy HBO and ESPN cheaper than anyone else, and this allowed him, when he bought an acquisition, to immediately improve margins by 500 basis points. So they were also very disciplined around pricing. There's a story from John Malone at TCI, where he showed up at a closing for a cable system in Hawaii, and the seller tried to move the price by $1 million, and he walked away. So they were consistent, very consistent in their pricing discipline around acquisitions. I want to conclude by quickly just walking you through Katharine Graham, who's one of the CEOs, ran the Washington Post company, had an amazing personal story. But she had been out of the workforce for 40 years when she got the job as CEO at Washington Post company. In her time at the helm, nearly 30 years, she massively outperformed the peer group. If you'd invested $100,000 with Katharine Graham, it was worth $8.9 million when she stepped down. If you'd invested in the peer group, it was worth $1.5 million. In the S&P 500,000. So what she did across these is she optimized free cash flow across her businesses, used very occasional debt issuances, only to fund acquisitions. She never issued any equity. And in terms of uses, she paid the lowest dividends in her industry consistently across that time. She invested in existing operations which were generally free cash positive and didn't require much investment. She reduced debt when she needed to after making acquisitions. She repurchased 40% of her stock. In terms of acquisitions, she had a very active period in the mid-1970s when she first took over, when the market was hit hard, and again in the mid-90s with no activity in the middle. And she added enormous value through doing that. So I guess I would conclude with 3 things for you to think about, or 3 sort of primary lessons. The first is capital allocation matters greatly over evergreen holding periods. The second thing is it's your job. It cannot be delegated. You need to do the math. You need to be involved in those decisions. And the third thing is that I would encourage you to think of your businesses in per share terms as much as possible. The denominator matters greatly to owners in the long term. So thank you all very much.